"Dad, I have no intention of paying you back. After all, I never asked to be born, did I? It's not like I signed some contract." She? Perhaps it was just a single sentence, spat out in a moment of anger. But those words, for the 82-year-old father who had sold his home, given up his workshop, and poured every ounce of his youth into raising his child, those words plunged into his heart like a final, fatal blade. He didn't yell back. He didn't offer a single word of resentment. He just quietly left the house. The house that had once been filled with the scent of pine and the sound of his family's laughter. And all that remained behind was a single envelope, an unsigned will, and a one-line message. Everything you thought was yours, was never yours to begin with. In that moment, the family was left speechless. Arthur Miller was born in a small village nestled in the green hills of western Vermont. It was the kind of place where, in the autumn, the maple leaves turned a deep, blood red, and in the spring, the sweet scent of apple blossoms would mix with the sharp smell of fresh sawdust. His parents were farmers, and life was so meager that there was no money for him to even consider high school. At the age of 15, Arthur left the village. He found work as an apprentice in a small woodshop along the Battenkill River. Every day, the boy's young arms were covered in new cuts and scrapes from carving tools and sandpaper. His days were spent sweeping floors from dawn till dusk, and then, finally, learning to shape the wood. Through it all, he never uttered a single word of complaint. The master of that workshop, a famously skilled craftsman, as stern as he was brilliant, once told him something that he never forgot. "Good wood doesn't argue with the saw," the old man had said. "It just waits for the day it becomes a roof for someone." All those words became etched deep in Arthur's soul, and perhaps it was from that day forward that he chose to live his life like a tree. Beaten by the rain, scorched by the sun, he would stand tall and silent, believing that his purpose was simply to be a support for others. For nearly 40 years, he built his own workshop, Miller & Sons Woodworking, from a one-room timber frame shed into a business that employed 18 craftsmen. He treated every one of his employees like family, and one of the few structures he ever built for the public, a small wooden bridge in the village of Westwood, still stands there today, a quiet testament to his life. It was the mark of a life without regrets. But life, as we know, is rarely so kind. His beloved wife, in the year Arthur turned 60, was taken from him far too suddenly by pancreatic cancer. It was only 4 months from the diagnosis. One cold winter afternoon, as the last of the asters wilted in their backyard, she drew her final, quiet breath in his arms. From then on, it was just a father and his son, alone in the house. At the time, his son, Michael, was a freshman at a prestigious private university in Boston. To cover the crushing tuition bills, Arthur did the unthinkable. He sold the family home, the very house his grandfather had built, with the old cedar in the yard and the deep well, the homestead that had been passed down through 3 generations. "Dad, I have to study architecture," Michael had told him. "It's the only way we'll ever get out of this life." Arthur had simply nodded in silence. And then, he signed the deed over to the bank. People in town would ask him, "Don't you regret it, Arthur?" He would just offer a faint smile and reply, "A house can be rebuilt. But a child's dream, once you let that slip away, it never comes back." He never asked for anything, and he never blamed anyone. He never once asked his son for help with money, nor did he ever scold him for visiting so rarely. He was just waiting for one simple phrase, "Thank you, Dad." He held on to the hope that one day he would finally hear those words. But that phrase, even after 20 long years, never arrived. The only messages he ever received from his son were brief, dismissive texts. "In a meeting right now? Swamped with a project this weekend. Let's try for another time, okay?" Arthur now lives a quiet, solitary life in a small cabin he built behind the old abandoned workshop, a toolbox, a cast-iron kettle, and a single, faded photograph of his wife holding their infant son. These are his only companions. Sometimes, he still works with his hands, making small things. A wooden serving tray, a pen holder, a simple wall shelf, all of them meant to be sent to his son. He expects nothing in return. He just wants to send a message. I want him to know that there's still a father in Vermont, watching over him. On the coldest winter nights, wrapped in a threadbare wool blanket, he closes his eyes and remembers the sound of his wife's laughter, the voice of his son as a little boy. And then, without making a sound, he quietly wipes a tear from his eye. This was a man who had once felled hundreds of great trees. A man who had built dozens of homes with his bare hands. Now, he lives huddled in a tiny room, barely 10 by 15 feet. But in his heart, not once has the word resentment ever taken root, because Arthur still believes. He believes that sacrifice will, one day, be rewarded. To this day, he keeps a worn, leather-bound notebook. For 20 years, he has meticulously recorded every dollar he ever spent for his son. Not to demand repayment, but so that he would never forget just how much he had loved him. But Arthur doesn't know it yet. He doesn't know that the most heartbreaking moment of his entire life is approaching far faster than he could ever imagine. And that after that day, he will no longer be able to remain the father who just watches in silence. For most of the years since his son Michael graduated from college, Arthur Miller had lived his life in silence. The son who once laughed and said, "I'll come back to Vermont someday and open a branch office," had now put down roots in a different world. He lived surrounded by the noise of the city, by blueprints and modern architecture. The firm his son had founded, Miller Design Studio. It had made a decent name for itself with its clean, minimalist interiors rooted in natural materials. It had even been featured once in an architectural magazine. When Arthur saw the article, he quietly cut it out. He tucked it inside his well-worn leather notebook and carefully taped it to the page with a piece of old cellophane tape. Sometimes, people from the village would ask him about it. "Your son's really something, isn't he, Arthur? A famous architect now, I hear." Arthur would just smile and say, "Yeah, he's a talented kid. As long as he lives his life as a good, honest man, that's all that matters to me." But he couldn't shake the feeling that the meaning of honest was growing more and more distant with each passing day. For the past few months, Arthur's vision in his right eye had been getting blurry. Things started looking double. At first, he figured it was just old age. But when he got to the point where he couldn't even tell the difference between a plank of pine and a piece of cedar, he finally made his way to a doctor. The diagnosis was cataracts. He needed surgery, and soon. If he wanted the procedure done without being put on a long waiting list, the out-of-pocket cost would be around $2,500. For a man living on a Social Security check of less than $800 a month, it was an impossibly large sum. After 2 days of wrestling with his pride, Arthur sent his son a text message. It was 9 o'clock in the morning when he hit send. "My eyes? The doctor says I have cataracts. Says I need an operation. I was wondering if you could, maybe lend me about $2,500? The reply arrived at 11 o'clock in the morning. It was just a single line. "In a meeting with an important client right now. We'll get back to you later." After that, there was no other message. Arthur didn't blame him. He just quietly pulled out an old bank passbook from a drawer and began to tally the savings he had carefully accumulated over so many years. The payment for the bookshelf he'd built for the town library, the cash he'd earned for mending the chairs at the diner, the small envelope he had tucked away at the bottom of his dresser drawer. Even after gathering every last dollar, he was still $600 short. He withdrew $1,900 from his account. The rest, he figured, he would have to borrow from someone. A name came to mind. An old friend, Frank. They had been apprentices together in their youth, learning the carpenter's trade side by side. Frank was retired now, having returned to Vermont to look after his health. That evening, the two men sat on the wooden porch, drinking tea. The faint, sharp scent of cedar still lingered in the cool air. Frank listened to the whole story without so much as a smirk. As he poured more tea, he murmured, his eyes on the cup. "You know, Arthur, in the 40 years I practiced law, the thing that broke my heart the most was watching an old parent crying in a Courtroom, begging the judge, please, just don't let them sell the house. And all the while, their own child would be sitting right there, staring straight ahead, refusing to even look at them. Arthur didn't say a word. He just watched as the petals from the last of the autumn roses were scattered by the wind across the yard. Frank continued, his voice a little lower than before. Arthur, you need to write a will. Get it done while you're still sharp. You need to get your affairs in order. Some kids, you see, they look at a living parent as nothing but a burden. Those words struck him with the force of a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut deep inside his chest. Arthur wasn't angry, but he felt something elsing, a cold, hollow wind blowing through the deepest parts of his heart. It was a feeling he couldn't put into words. It was as if the things he had believed in for 80 years, the unspoken love between a father and son, the sacred bond of blood, were fading away, like moss on an old barn roof, washed pale by years of cold rain. That night, Arthur took out that worn leather notebook. It was the same one he had used since his wife was still alive, its pages filled with records of orders, deadlines, and the names of the craftsmen he had employed. On the very last page, for the first time in his life, he wrote down what was truly in his heart. November 3rd. If my grandson ever reads this notebook someday, I want him to remember this. Your grandpa believed in the unconditional love between a father and a son. Bouchier father, my son, he has made that belief waver. His hand trembled, and the letters were no longer straight. But in every single word, you could feel the weary heart of a man who had dedicated 80 years of his life to that belief. He had no idea if his son would ever remember this message tomorrow. He didn't even know if anyone would ever read this notebook at all. But in that moment, Arthur Miller felt one thing with absolute certainty. He had lost all confidence that his life, a life of quiet sacrifice, had ever held any meaning at all. The surgery was a success. Frank lent him the money he needed. During the 3 days he spent in the hospital, he never once received a call from his son. The only phone call that came was from his grandson, who was still in elementary school. Grandpa, what do you want to eat when you get out of the hospital? I'll make it for you. That small voice was enough to bring a gentle warmth back to Arthur's chest. Perhaps that little boy was the only thing that remained in his heart, the one single flicker of hope he had left. That winter, Vermont was colder than anyone could remember. A thick blanket of snow settled silently on the eaves of the old wooden house, and whenever a draft of wind slipped through a crack, the old man's body would shudder against his will. Arthur Miller should have been used to the cold. For decades he had worked in an unheated workshop, shaping wood with his own 2 hands. But the chill he felt this winter, it wasn't coming from the outside. It was coming from deep within. The old wood shop now sat completely unused. The young craftsmen who had once worked for him had all moved on, each finding their own path in life. All that was left was Arthur, all alone, and the stacks of lumber, lined up as if they were sleeping, dreaming peacefully as time passed them by. One day near the end of December, when the morning sun cast a weak light over the yard, Arthur went out back to repair a section of the decaying wooden fence. It was the fence that ran alongside the rose bushes his wife had so lovingly tended. And even now, he cared for each post, polishing and shaping the wood with the same devotion. But the ground was slick with half-melted snow, and his foot slipped, sending him tumbling down onto the stone steps. The instant he heard the dry, cracking sound, a pain so sharp shot through him that he couldn't even cry out. When he next opened his eyes, he was lying in a hospital bed. The doctor's diagnosis was a fractured hip. He would need to be hospitalized for at least 3 weeks. As he was signing the admission forms, Arthur mumbled to the nurse, "I'll probably be fine on my own. You don't need to let my family know." Yesiga he knew, in some part of his heart, that even if he did call, the only reply he would get was that all too familiar phrase, "I'm busy right now." 3 days passed, and no one came to visit. The door to his hospital room finally opened in the middle of his 2nd week. A little boy, carrying a small box of clementines and a comic book, ran in with a bright smile on his face. "Grandpa, I'm here." His voice instantly chased away the scent of antiseptic and the heavy silence of the room. Arthur smiled softly and reached out a trembling hand to pat his grandson's head. "Did your mom and dad come with you?" The boy shook his head. "Dad said he was busy, and Mom said she doesn't like hospitals. So, I had a driver bring me." Then, as if he'd just remembered, he added, "Dad told me something though," he said. "Grandpa's tough, so you don't need to worry about him." That casual remark, meant to be comforting, felt like a sharp needle piercing his chest. Arthur didn't say anything. He just turned his gaze to the window. Snow was falling outside, soft and delicate as tissue paper. But inside his heart-chin, a furious blizzard was just beginning to rage. On the day he was discharged, the only person who came to pick him up was his grandson. He never saw his son, not even once. After he got home, Arthur stood alone in his kitchen and brewed a cup of chamomile tea. He wrapped both hands around the warm mug, trying to stop their slight tremor. Was it from the cold, or from his age, or was it something else entirely? That night, Arthur sent a message to his son. It was the first time in years he had ever reached out. The first time he had ever made a demand. "We need to talk. Come see me." He sent it at 8014 p.m. The delivery receipt showed that it had been read almost immediately, but there was no reply. The night wore on. It was nearly 11 o'clock when the front door finally opened. His son walked into the room, a smartphone in one hand and a tired, annoyed look on his face. So, what's this about? I have an early flight for a business trip tomorrow." Arthur remained silent and simply pointed to the wooden chair across from him. A heavy quiet filled the small room, broken only by the steady ticking of the old clock on the wall. The clock on the wall was a gift his wife had chosen years ago. Its ticking was the only sound that continued to mark the passage of time. After a long, heavy silence, Arthur Miller finally spoke. "I just want to ask you one thing. When I told you I needed $2,500 for eye surgery, you didn't say a word. When I was in the hospital for 3 weeks, you never even came to see me. Why?" His son, Michael, leaned back in the wooden chair and crossed his arms over his chest. "Look, I'm not trying to blame you, Dad, but I'm not living my life out of some sense of obligation." Arthur's eyebrows twitched, a barely perceptible motion. "What did you just say?" "I have no intention of paying you back. After all, I never asked to be born, did I?" In that instant, all the air seemed to vanish from the room. There was no shouting, no roar of anger. The words simply hummed there, striking the old man's heart with the clean, blunt force of a mallet. Arthur Miller stared at his son in silence. For this man, he had sold the family home. For this man, he had spent countless nights hunched over his workbench, carving wood, making toys, providing everything he could possibly give. And yet now, no sound would come from his own throat. His voice was trapped, the words unable to escape. Michael stood up, a flicker of awkwardness in his eyes. He shoved his smartphone into his pocket. "If you just wanted to lecture me, I'm leaving," he said. "I'm busy, you know." The heavy front door closed with a thud. A draft of cold air snaked its way into the small kitchen. Arthur Miller just sat there, his gaze fixed on the cup of tea that had long since gone cold. In his hands, he held nothing. These were the same hands that had built bridges, the same hands that had once held his wife's. Now they were just trembling, cold, and empty. Something, without a doubt, had just broken. But he hadn't heard a sound. Slowly, he pushed himself up from the chair and walked toward the wooden staircase, taking one step at a time. Upstairs, in his small bedroom, there was an old chest of drawers. It was where he kept his leather-bound notebook, his favorite fountain pen, and all the other things that mattered most in his life. He didn't know yet what he was going to write tonight. But he knew one thing for certain now. This was not something that could be dismissed as just a small disagreement. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't even about the lonely weeks in the hospital. It was something more. His son, with his own mouth, had as good as said, "You are not my father." Silence filled every corner of the house. After the front door had closed, Arthur Miller did not return to the kitchen. Instead, he walked slowly toward the living room. An old photograph still hung on the wall there. It was a family portrait, taken on a crisp autumn day in a state park. Arthur was holding his son, who couldn't have been more than 3, and his wife, wearing a simple blue dress, was standing beside them, leaning in gently. Behind them, the maple trees were a blaze of brilliant crimson. Arthur stood before that single photograph for a long, long time, saying nothing, just looking. Outside, the winter wind howled, rattling the window panes. A stray newspaper flyer caught on the fence was ripped free and sent tumbling into the gray sky. Inside, Arthur gently rested his hand on the wooden frame. He spoke in a low murmur, as if talking to his late wife. "Are you watching this? Our boy. The one we raised with so much care, he just told me he doesn't owe his parents a thing." Not a single tear fell from his eyes. But the deep shadows behind them, etched there by the long years of his life, seemed to say everything that needed to be said. Eventually, Arthur returned to the kitchen. He opened a small drawer in the little side table where he kept his things. From inside, he took out a worn handkerchief. Wrapped within it was a crisp Christmas card with a new $20 bill tucked inside. He had been preparing these cards for years. A small tradition for giving his grandson a little something for the holidays. But this year, for some reason, he just couldn't bring himself to even begin the preparation. Quietly, but with a sense of finality, Arthur placed the card and the money back in the drawer. It was as if, with his own hands, he was gently folding up the last little piece of faith he had left. On his way to the bedroom, he paused in front of the tall wooden cabinet where he kept his tools. The rows of wooden boxes held his chisels, his hand planes, his carving knives. His fingertips unconsciously brushed against the old, scarred wood of the cabinet doors. Every scratch held a memory. The memory of a house he had finished. The memory of a grateful client. And the memory of the first time his apprentice had called him teacher. All of it was still there, embedded in the tips of his fingers. And then, a thought came to him. After I'm gone, what will be left? Not the bitter words a child might say behind his back. Not just a pile of assets or property. It would be something else. The quiet proof of a life lived honestly, earnestly, and with integrity. That, he knew, was what would remain. And in that very moment, Arthur Miller understood with a quiet, calm clarity. He knew exactly what he had to do. The nights in Vermont grew colder as winter deepened, a chill that seemed to seep into your very bones. The wind whistled through the gaps in the old timber frame house, making the beams creak and groan as if someone were sighing in the darkness. Arthur Miller sat at the wooden desk in his small upstairs study. The soft glow of a desk lamp illuminated the worn, varnished surface. He gently opened a drawer and took out the leather-bound notebook he had used. Ever since he was a young man, its pages were crammed with design sketches from old jobs and records of deliveries made long ago. But what he was about to write tonight would be the quietest, most resolute decision of his life. Beside the notebook lay a single white envelope. The return address was for the law office of his friend Frank Collins, the man who had offered him that quiet warning just a few weeks before. Arthur slit the envelope open, pulled out a sheet of paper, and slowly picked up his fountain pen. I, Arthur Miller, born May 4th, 1942, being of sound mind and memory, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament. He started with those words, forming each letter with deliberate care. He focused his eye, the one that had just been operated on, and put all the strength he had into his gnarled, steady hand. The savings he had accumulated over more than 50 years of hard work amounted to roughly $120,000. He specified its distribution as follows: 1/3 to be donated to the American Craft Council. He added a small note, to help young people carry on our traditional skills. 1/3 to be placed in an educational trust for his grandson. It could only be accessed, however, once the boy turned 18, and only if he showed a genuine interest in pursuing woodworking or another traditional craft. Arthur still believed. He believed that the small boy was a flicker of hope, a connection to the future. The remaining 1/3 was to go to his former apprentice, Jason. Jason had been an orphan when Arthur took him in. Now, He was a grown man with his own successful woodshop over in New Hampshire. He was the one person who never failed to send a Christmas card each year, the one person who still called him teacher. And then, for the house where Arthur had spent nearly his entire life, he wrote, "My home in Westwood, Vermont is to be sold upon my death, with the entirety of the proceeds to be donated to the Westwood Regional High School Scholarship Fund. The purpose of this fund is to provide financial assistance to students from difficult economic backgrounds who wish to pursue a career in the traditional crafts and trades." At the very end of the will, Arthur added a final note. He wrote it in small, precise letters, addressed not to the court or the executor, but to a single individual. They were his last words to his son, Michael. "I hereby bequeath nothing from my estate to my son, Michael Miller. My reason is this. On the evening of December 13th, 2024, he said to me, in no uncertain terms, the following words: 'Dad, I have no intention of paying you back. After all, I never asked to be born, did I? It's not like I signed some contract.' I have come to understand those words as his declaration, from his own mouth, that the bond between us as father and son has been severed. If the day should ever come when you find yourself understanding what has been lost, I pray it is not because you are left with nothing, but because you have found the courage to face your own regrets." He placed the pen down. He folded the pages neatly and slid them back into the heavy cream envelope. From a small wooden box on his desk, he took out a stick of dark red sealing wax and a small brass stamp. It was a custom stamp he had made years ago, with the simple initial M intertwined with a wood plane, his personal maker's mark. He melted the wax, dripped it onto the flap of the envelope, and pressed the seal into it with a quiet, steady hand. The next morning, Arthur took the sealed will to Frank Collins's law office. He asked Frank to witness it and keep the original safe. As part of the official legal process, Frank didn't ask any questions. He just looked his old friend in the eye and said quietly, "Are you absolutely sure this is what you want, Arthur?" Arthur managed a faint smile. He gave a slow, firm nod. "I'm not angry, Frank. It's just, the things you hold precious, you have to leave them with people who will understand their value." After the paperwork was signed and filed away, he stood for a moment on the office porch, looking up at the winter sky. The sun was a pale disk, barely visible through a thin layer of clouds. The wind carried the faint smell of brewing coffee and cinnamon from the diner, down the street. He closed his eyes and drew in a long, deep breath. He let it out slowly, and a quiet smile touched his lips, as if he had just set down a burden he'd been carrying for decades. It wasn't born of resentment, nor of anger. It was simply the resolve to let go. It was the feeling a master craftsman has after finishing his final piece of work. The quiet satisfaction of closing the lid on his toolbox and walking away, the job complete. That evening he began to tidy his small study. He took down the old, hand-carved sign that hung over the door, the one that read, "Miller and Sons Woodworking." He wiped the dust from the letters and carefully wrapped it in a clean linen cloth. Then, he opened his leather notebook once more. On the very last blank page, he wrote, "Sharing a last name does not guarantee that you share the same heart. And so, rather than pass on a burden, I will bring this chapter to a close myself." Arthur Miller's life had quietly, but definitively, turned a page. He knew it with a certainty that settled deep in his bones. He knew that one day, his son would finally understand that everything he had taken for granted, everything he believed was his by right, was, in fact, a gift he had been given from the very start. After finishing at Frank Collins's law office, Arthur Miller didn't head straight home. His feet seemed to guide him on their own, down a narrow path that led to the Batten Kill River. It was the same spot where he used to take Michael fishing when he was just a little boy back in elementary school, a place of cherished memories along the riverbank. The old stone retaining wall was still there, just as it had been back then. The water still flowed with the same calm, gentle current. But the river of time, that was one current that could never be turned back. Arthur sat down on a stone bench by the water. The trees lining the bank had long since shed their leaves, their bare branches shivering slightly in the cold winter wind. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, foil-wrapped piece of butterscotch candy. It was the kind his wife used to love. He unwrapped it and placed it in his mouth, letting the sweet, slightly smoky flavor slowly dissolve on his tongue. He thought to himself that perhaps the deepest sadness a person can feel isn't being betrayed. No, it's the moment you realize that all the love you poured into someone never truly reached them at all. Arthur didn't hate his son. He just felt a profound sense of loss. All those wooden toys he'd stayed up late to carve. The extra money he'd quietly deposited into Michael's account to help with college textbooks. The simple hope of a happy birthday call, a single letter in the mail, or even just a few simple words. "How are you, Dad? Thanks for everything." Even those small hopes, in the end, none of them had ever arrived. Arthur sat there on the bench, unmoving, until the sun dipped below the hills and the surface of the river turned to silver. Finally, a lone streetlight flickered on nearby. He rose to his feet and slowly made his way home. That night, Arthur sat at the old wooden table in his kitchen. Beside him sat a cold teapot and a porcelain mug with a small chip on the rim. It was a gift his wife had given him years ago. To celebrate the day he officially opened his workshop, he opened the leather notebook that lay on the table. It was filled with old sketches, order sheets, and fragmented journal entries written in faded ink. He turned the pages slowly, one after another. One page read, "Michael graduated from high school today. He told me he wants to study architecture." I nearly cried, not because I was worried, but because, for the first time in a long time, I felt like I still had something of value to give. On another page, he'd written, "Jason did good work today." Watched him wipe down every single tool before putting it away. It was like seeing a reflection of my younger self. Every single entry was a testament to a life lived in the service of others. And now, he was reading through it all again, quietly, as if he were balancing the final ledger of his own life. He wasn't doing it to place blame or to prove a point to anyone else. He was doing it simply to remind himself, "I lived my life as an honest man. The rest is no longer in my hands." Before heading to bed, Arthur gently ran his hand over the worn leather cover of the notebook, placed it back in the desk drawer, and turned the key in the lock. That night, the snow began to fall again in Vermont. It came down thicker and colder this time, silently blanketing the roof of the small house and the bare branches of the trees in the yard. Arthur stood at the window, just watching the snowfall. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But he knew, with absolute certainty, that from this moment forward, everything was different. You can never get the past back, but you can choose how you bring it to a close, properly, with your own two hands. On Tuesday morning, just as the snow finally tapered off, Arthur Miller left his house. There was no one there to see him off. Not a word, not a glimpse of his son, who lived less than 3 miles away. In his hand, Arthur carried just one thing, a small, wooden suitcase he had crafted himself a decade earlier. Inside, there were a few changes of winter clothes, a single old photograph of his wife, and the leather notebook now safely locked. The car service he'd called pulled away from the curb, driving quietly through the streets of Westwood. The old covered bridge where he and his wife used to walk, the general store where he'd bought candy for his grandson, the middle school he'd attended as a boy. Each landmark passed by the window, appearing for a moment in the side view mirror like memories playing in reverse. But Arthur never once turned his head to look back. It wasn't out of coldness or indifference. It was because he knew that everything he truly needed to protect, he already carried inside his heart. As for the rest, he had decided to leave it to the wind. The day before he left, Arthur had gone to his son's house. He had let himself in with the spare key he still carried and had quietly placed a single white envelope on the dining room table. Inside was a notarized copy of a last will and testament, a photograph of an upscale assisted living facility in the Berkshires called Berkshire Meadows, and a single handwritten sheet of paper. On it, there was just one sentence, written in a steady, familiar hand. Everything you thought was yours was never yours to begin with. There was no name on it, and not a single word of accusation. But that message, as light as the wind, yet as sharp as a shard of glass, plunged deep into the heart. Late that night, his son, Michael, returned home. He saw the envelope on the polished surface of the dining room table. At first, he looked at it with indifference. But then he tore it open and began to read. Toward the end of the will, he found the clause, "Rut, to my son, Michael Miller, for reasons both legal and moral, I hereby bequeath nothing from my estate." He drew in a sharp breath. His face, illuminated by the cold, sterile light of the kitchen, had turned a ghostly pale. Next, he picked up the photograph of the facility. It was a 3-story building made of red brick, with elegant white trim. A small red circle had been drawn around one of the windows on the second floor. Beneath it, a few words were written. "I am doing just fine," was nothing more. No mention of coming back. Not even a spare house key had been left behind. A week later, Michael drove up to Vermont and went to his father's old house. The front door was locked. A neighbor who was out walking her dog simply said, "Oh, Mr. Miller moved away." Didn't say a word to anyone. The older folks in town just shook their heads. He was such a decent, hard-working man. For that son of his to treat him that way. Soon, the rumors started to spread. Arthur Miller, the man who had once taught woodworking at the local vocational school, the same man who had quietly donated money to help rebuild after the floods in 2004, had apparently left his entire estate to people outside his own family. Michael's frustration grew into anger. He called his father's old number, but no one answered. He sent an email, but it went without a reply. Finally, he sent a text, just like all the others he had sent before. "Dad, what is this all about? I'm busy, you know." The status showed, "Delivered," but the word "read" would never appear again. Meanwhile, at that very moment, in a small, quiet room in the hills of western Massachusetts, Arthur Miller was beginning a new life. While not exactly luxurious, Berkshire Meadows offered a peaceful, well-tended environment. There was a courtyard designed like a classic New England garden, a quiet reading room, and every Wednesday afternoon, they held a small arts and crafts class for the residents. In the morning, he would slowly sip a cup of hot tea. In the afternoon, he would walk through the garden, watching the pine needles drift down onto the flagstone paths. At night, he would open his old leather notebook and add another entry. The Berkshires. Day 3. The air is crisp and the wind is calm. No one has called. No one asks anything of me. But my heart feels surprisingly light. He wasn't running away. He was just quietly starting over. One day, during the craft class, a young intern, a care assistant, was stunned when she saw Arthur's hands as he touched a piece of wood. Were you a woodworker by any chance?" Arthur just smiled and gave a slight nod. Soon after, he picked up a carving chisel. His fingertips trembled slightly, and his vision was still a little blurry. But the precision in that single cut was breathtaking. The younger staff members watched him, their eyes wide with awe. And before long, everyone started calling him Mr. Miller. Here, nobody knew his past. They didn't know he was a father who had been hurt by his son. They didn't know he was a man who had given away his entire life's savings. They just treated him with respect, as the last craftsman who never put down his tools. And there, under the quiet roof of a place where the snow was beginning to pile up silently, his hands began to find their purpose once more. It wasn't for revenge. It wasn't to prove a point to anyone. It was simply to prove this. Even without a family, a person can, until the very end, choose their own beautiful way to finish their story. Arthur Miller's story had quietly, and with absolute certainty, begun a new chapter. At that same time, in Chicago, Michael, in the middle of a board meeting, was starting to feel inexplicably restless. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, and his words were as polished as ever. But he would find his mind drifting, his thoughts wandering to another place entirely. One day, he was giving a presentation to a major client about a new residential design. As he got to the part about the layout of the living room, he suddenly faltered. his words catching in his throat. A junior architect on his team tilted his head and remarked, "Mr. Miller, this living room, it has the feel of a classic Vermont farmhouse, doesn't it?" For a moment, Michael just stared at the screen. He was right. This was the exact same layout his father had built all those years ago. The pocket doors instead of a solid wall, the wide plank pine floors, the low handcrafted coffee table, and the kitchen that always carried the faint, sweet scent of freshly cut wood. The smell of the house he had grown up in had seeped into his design without him even realizing it. He said nothing and quietly clicked to the next slide. That night, when Michael returned to his high-rise apartment in Chicago, he didn't even turn on the lights. He just stood there, leaning against the front door. He looked up at the smooth, blank ceiling, a surface where no memories had ever been made. There was no old family dining table where his grandfather used to sit. He couldn't hear his mother's voice calling him from the kitchen. In this room, which didn't even have the scent of new wood, there was only a profound and hollow silence. It was a silence that felt strangely familiar. It was just like the father's silence that had been left in that single white envelope. He picked up his smartphone and scrolled back through his old messages from a long, long time ago. An exchange from when he had just started his own firm. "Dad, I landed my first contract today." "That's great news. Always protect your client's trust. And don't ever forget your roots." That might have been the last time his father had ever sent him words that held any warmth. He closed the screen and let out a long, quiet sigh. And in that moment, he understood. His father hadn't just left without a word. He had already said everything he needed to say in the form of his silence. That silence itself was the quiet, irrefutable verdict. Meanwhile, back in the Berkshires, Arthur Miller, after finishing the first day of his new woodworking class, returned to his room, opened his leather notebook and wrote, "I don't want to look back anymore. With every piece I carve, it becomes a part of this new life. To leave nothing to those who do not cherish it. That, too, is a way of protecting the beauty you believe in." The moon that night was full and clear, and its silver light shone down gently on the gardens of Berkshire Meadows. Arthur quietly closed the window, turned off the lamp, and lay down in his bed. He no longer struggled to fall asleep the way he used to. The following spring, just as the melting snow began to gently moisten the rooftops of the old towns, in New England, a small article appeared in the Arts and Education section of a local newspaper. Former master woodworker, Arthur Miller, once a respected teacher of the craft in Vermont, attends the awards ceremony for the Arthur Miller Craftsmanship Scholarship, which he established for students from low-income families. In the accompanying photograph, a small, white-haired old man was shown handing a certificate to a high school student. In a crisp school uniform, his hands trembled, but only slightly. His gaze, however, it was sharp, and it glinted like the edge of a newly honed chisel. Behind him hung a hand-carved wooden sign. The letters burned into the polished oak read, "Miller Woodcraft. To shape wood is to shape oneself." This news, this photograph would, by a stroke of chance, find its way into the hands of one particular person. That day, Michael was in a coffee shop in downtown Chicago, waiting for a client meeting to begin. A newspaper lay folded on the small table beside his laptop, and then, a name seemed to leap off the page, catching his eye. Arthur Miller. He picked up the paper. As he read the article, he saw his father's words quoted in large, bold print right at the beginning. "I will not leave my estate to a man who treats the word families like an IOU. These hands, and a heart full of gratitude. That is the only true inheritance a person can have." A tremor ran through Michael's own hands. His lips felt suddenly dry. It wasn't just surprise. It was the shock of realizing that his father's silence, that long, quiet absence, could return with such a powerful, deafening echo. He had never imagined it. The article went on. In addition to his savings, which total approximately $120,000, the full proceeds from the sale of his home in Westwood, Vermont, have been placed in a trust. This Miller Craftsmanship Funds is now being managed by a former apprentice who serves as the foundation's director. And then, at the very end, there was a single sentence that felt like a final, twisting blow. Mr. Miller is currently residing at Berkshire Meadows, a senior living community in western Massachusetts. He is not accepting visits from the press or any other unannounced parties. The very next day, Michael drove to Massachusetts. He carried a bouquet of white flowers and an old photo album. The spring wind was cold, but a thin sheen of sweat had formed on his forehead. Berkshire Meadows was a quiet, immaculately kept facility. A small, man-made brook gurgled through a manicured garden. The warm, sweet scent of fresh-baked apple pie drifted from the dining hall. Michael walked up to the front desk. "My name is Michael Miller," he said. "I'm here to see Arthur Miller. I'm his son. Can I please see him, just for a few minutes?" A young woman at the reception desk checked a binder and then answered in a polite, measured tone, "I'm sorry, sir. Mr. Miller has filed paperwork declining any unscheduled visitations. And the category of families is not listed among his approved visitors." Michael couldn't believe what he was hearing. I'm his son, his actual son. I just want to talk to him. Please." The receptionist lowered her voice, her expression softening with a hint of sympathy. "I understand this must be difficult, sir. But it seems your father has already given his answer through his actions." She gestured toward a community bulletin board in the main lobby. In the very center was a large photograph of Arthur Miller surrounded by a group of young students in a woodworking class. He was smiling. And next to the photo, a small hand-lettered card read, "Family is found where there is gratitude. Where there is none, there is no longer a need to speak the name." Michael left the facility with nothing. He had gained nothing at all. On the long bus ride home, he just stared out the window, his gaze empty. The rolling hills of the Berkshires, shrouded in a light spring fog, passed by in a blur. His chest was filled with a weight he had never felt before. It wasn't quite regret. No, it was something different. It was more like he no longer knew where he was standing, as if the ground beneath his feet had vanished, a profound sense of loss. When he returned to his apartment in Chicago, he looked around at the sterile, impersonal space, the high-end designer sofa, the Italian espresso machine, the abstract painting hanging on the wall. Everything in the room, every single object, felt completely and utterly empty. He sat down and opened the photo album, the one he had meant to give his father in Massachusetts, the one that had never left his hands. The first photograph was from his college graduation. There he was, wearing a cap and gown, and beside him, his father was smiling, a quiet, gentle smile, his hand resting softly on his son's shoulder. Another picture showed the small wooden bridge his father had built back home. A much younger Michael, his face smeared with mud, was grinning from the middle of the bridge, and in the distance, his father was waving. But now, they were just pictures. That's all they were. Around that same time, at the facility in Massachusetts, Arthur Miller was sitting on the edge of a small rock garden, his hands wrapped around a warm mug of tea. A spring breeze rustled the leaves, and a few pale pink petals from a nearby dogwood tree drifted down to his feet. An old man, another resident, approached and spoke to him in a low voice. "There was a young man at the front gate today, Arthur. He said he was your son." Arthur Miller showed no surprise at all. He just nodded, took a slow sip of his tea. "I know. You're not going to see him?" Arthur set the mug down on the stone bench beside him. He stared off toward the distant hills and replied, "It's not that I don't want to see him." But a door that was closed with words, "Cannot be opened with tears." A set of wind chimes hanging from the porch roof tinkled softly, a quiet announcement of the March wind's arrival. And at that very same moment, back in Chicago, the sign for Miller Design Studio was being quietly removed from the front of the building. It had taken him some time, but Michael had finally made his decision. The name Miller, even if it was his by blood, was something he no longer had the right to carry. Not after he had lost his gratitude. That night, after returning from the long trip, Michael found he couldn't sleep. The apartment was unnervingly quiet. He walked out onto the small balcony. It was the place he used to come when he was stuck on a project, his escape, where he would smoke and try to clear his head. But tonight, the cigarette he lit with trembling fingers burned halfway down, before turning to ash, forgotten. His gaze followed the silent stream of headlights on the street below, then drifted up to the starless city sky, and a thought, unbidden, came to him. That day, what if I had just replied to his message? What would have changed? What if I had just sent one text, "Are you okay?" or driven to the hospital, just for one visit? Or just said the words, "I'm sorry." If I had done any of those things, that man, my father, maybe he wouldn't have left so quietly. In that instant, a memory that had been buried deep inside him floated to the surface. It was a winter night, back when he was in the 6th grade. He had come home angry after being teased at school for his worn-out sneakers, and in a fit of frustration, he had thrown the shoes against the wall. His father hadn't said a word. He just quietly picked them up, and with a needle and thread, he stitched the frayed seams back together, one careful stitch at a time. And the next morning, the repaired sneakers were sitting on his desk, and beside them was a small, folded piece of paper. "Can't afford new ones just yet, son. But your dad believes in you. You're going to go farther than anyone." He remembered the warmth that had filled his chest back then. But as he grew older, he had pushed that feeling aside, buried it somewhere deep. The man who had told him to go farther was the same man who had stayed right where he was, his gaze fixed on the ground. The man who had bent over his workbench thousands and thousands of times so that his son would never have to bow his head to anyone. He had forgotten all of it. At some point, he had started to see it all as something he was simply owed, something that was his by right. He understood now. His father's silence wasn't an absence of words. It was a form of love so deep that it believed words were not necessary. But now, that simple truth, that thing he had taken for granted, it was all gone. Everything was now completely out of his reach. He let out a long, slow breath, pressed the dying cigarette into the ashtray, and walked quietly back into his apartment. At that same time, in the senior community in Massachusetts, Arthur Miller was sitting in his small room, bathed in the soft light of a single, dim lamp, perfectly still and perfectly silent. In every line etched upon his face, a long lifetime was held. And yet, his expression held a strange and peaceful sense of calm. He picked up a small slip of paper and taped it to his wooden toolbox. It read, "For next week's class, a sample carving, The Spring Wind. Just try to let the wood tell you its own story." Whether anyone would ever understand those words, he had no idea. But there was one thing he knew for certain. Now that he felt his own heart had finally returned to the place where it truly belonged, he knew that whatever came next, it would be all right to leave it all in the hands of time. Outside, the spring wind was blowing softly. It was early April, the time of year when the dogwood petals drifted down like a soft, white snow. At Berkshire Meadows, an assisted living community in the green hills of western Massachusetts, a special kind of class was underway. In a corner of the common area, Arthur Miller stood quietly before a small group of 5 high school students and 3 other elderly residents. On the tables before them, blocks of squared-off lumber were laid out in neat rows. Each one had a different grain, a different character. Some were coarse, some were soft, some were smooth, and some were rough to the touch. He didn't begin with a lecture the way a teacher might. Instead, he simply posed a single question. "Everyone, to make a good box, what do you think is the very first thing you need?" One of the high school boys answered, "Good wood." Arthur gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Yes, but that alone isn't enough. Even the best wood, if you don't handle it right, it will eventually rot." He picked up one of the blocks and held it up for them to see. People are the same. Every single person has their own worth. But if they're never listened to, never loved, never acknowledged, that worth is just quietly forgotten. The room fell completely silent. Just as the air began to feel a little heavy, he gently placed the block of wood back on the table and continued. "It took me a very long time to learn that living a good life is not always the same as being treated well. But to live with integrity, that means you don't turn your back on your own conscience. His gaze was fixed on something far away, as if he were speaking softly to someone he had not yet met. A few days later, Arthur was sitting alone on the edge of the rock garden, just feeling the spring breeze. In his hand, he held a single letter that had arrived from Chicago. It was from his granddaughter. "Dear Grandpa, I heard you're living in Massachusetts now. Dad said we don't need to see him anymore, but I don't believe him. I remember how you used to sharpen my pencils, and the wooden pencil box you gave me in the first grade. I remember everything. When summer vacation starts, I'm going to ask Mom to bring me to see you. Please wait for me." The handwriting was still childish and unpracticed, but every single letter was like a gentle ray of light, piercing through a heart that had been closed for so long. Arthur smiled. And then, he gently touched the very last line. "When I grow up, I want to be a woodworker, just like you." He wasn't expecting anything. He had no intention of forcing anything upon her, but he understood. If there was just one person, even one, who was trying to understand his heart, that was more than enough. In the days that followed, Arthur's life didn't change. He taught the younger staff how to tell the difference between real wood and plywood. He took other residents for walks in the nearby pine forest, telling them about the smell of the woods after a summer rain. It was a subtle difference in scent, one that could only be known by a person who had spent decades living alongside the trees. At night, as he always did, he would open his leather-bound notebook and quietly write down his thoughts about the morning mist or the afternoon tea. One day's entry read, "If there is a next life, I would want to be a woodworker again. It's not because the wood is beautiful, it's because wood, it doesn't lie. Whoever's hands touch it, their true nature is revealed." Now, at 82 years old, he no longer felt the need to be acknowledged. Awards, fame, the continuation of the family name, he didn't need any of it. All he needed was one thing, a quiet heart. And that quietness was not something that had been given to him by someone else. It was something he had protected, all on his own. Meanwhile, in Chicago, his son, Michael, had slowly begun to change. He took down the sign for Miller Design Studio and quietly moved his office to a smaller space near his old university. He started collaborating with young craftsmen who were dedicated to traditional woodworking, and he began to distance himself from flashy projects and grand displays of success. The one thing he never let go of was a single family photo album. There were moments when he would flip through the pages, and for a long time, he would just stare at the image of his father, standing silently in the background, just watching over him. One night, he sent an anonymous email to the facility. "Thank you for not betraying the wood. Thank you for believing that a person should live with integrity. I don't have the courage to call you Dad yet, but the way you would quietly drink your tea, the sound of you shaping a piece of wood, the way your back looked when you were angry, but chose to remain silent. I can still remember it all. Someday, if I can ever make a chair that won't so much as creak when you sit in it, when that day comes, will you try it for me?" There was no reply. But he thought to himself, these words don't need a reply. A few months later, a short interview with Arthur Miller was published in a Chicago newspaper. A reporter had asked him, "Is there anything you'd like to say to the younger generation today?" Arthur smiled softly and said this, "There are two things that matter. First, that no one has the right to demand to be thanked. And second, you must never confuse family with an inheritance. It isn't held together by legal value. It's held together by the heart." Those words were clipped and shared thousands of times on social media, and comments poured in one after another. "I've been silent with my parents for so long, I always took it for granted. I want to call them right now. Say thank you to the people you can, while you still can." And so, the story of Arthur Miller, a single woodworker, quietly came to a close. There was no tearful reunion. There were no dramatic embraces, no grand apologies. All there was the image of a father who, even after being rejected, continued to live his life with unwavering integrity and who, in that quietness, found his true dignity. Yes, just because you share blood, it doesn't mean that you also share a heart. But the choice to be a good person, that is something that requires no one's permission at all. What do you think? What if the person who raised you was treated like a debt that never had to be repaid? What if the moment comes when you remember that you should have just said that one simple phrase, "Thank you"? May that moment arrive while there is still time. And so, if you are a person who, like Arthur Miller, has spent your entire life living for the sake of other people, then please, do not ever forget this. Your true worth is not found in the praise you might receive from others. It is found in the quiet, undeniable fact that you never betrayed yourself. Please leave your own thoughts and feelings in the comments section. Someone, right now, surely needs to read what you have to say.